Hello and welcome to another interview in the PoSoCoMeS series. My guest today is Diana Dumitru, who is Associate Professor of History at Creangă State University of Moldova in Chișinău. Hello, Diana.
Thank you.
And Diana is not in the field of memory studies as such. She's a historian who has worked on different aspects of Jewish history in Moldova and Romania, both in the interwar period, during the Holocaust, and also in the post-war era. And Diana, I wanted to start by talking about your actual research projects before then discussing contemporary memory debates. So maybe you could tell us a few words about your path as a historian and how your research interests have developed.
Well, my path as a historian started from the study of 19th century. It was diplomatic history. But then after I defended my PhD, actually, interestingly, when I was in United States on a US State Department program, it just coincided with the time when Jan Gross published his book, Neighbors. So because of that book, I got really interested in the topic of Jewish history and the Holocaust. And I just wanted to learn for myself, to find out about what happened to the Jews from my own country. And suddenly I discovered that basically there is not much to read. And I was particularly interested in the Jewish-Gentile relationship, and there was zero things to read. So I had a meeting with a scholar, Radu Ioanid, from the Holocaust Museum at the time, because I was in DC. And I explained that this is what I'm interested in, and I would like to find something to read. And then Radu Ioanid told me, it's a great topic, but you'll need to write the book before being able to read it. So this is how actually everything started. And at the time it looked like a funny joke, but indeed in 2016, I did publish a book with Cambridge University Press that was focusing on this particular issue, on the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in my own country and Moldova, Bessarabia particularly, and also looking at the relationship between Jews and Gentiles in Transnistria, World War II Transnistria, that was under the control of Romanians. And I expanded into the interwar era because I was also interested in understanding the background, the premises, the state policies that also I realized had a big impact on the quality of these relationships. So that was my previous project, and now I moved into like two parallel projects. My current project that I'm working on is about the fate of Jews in Soviet Moldavia during late Stalinism, and trying to analyze like multiple aspects of Jewish life in Soviet Moldavia. Starting with the economy, social life, cultural life, religious life, but also, of course, like persecution. You cannot avoid this topic. Maybe the difference that I am trying to make so to kind of find my niche, not that so many studies on Jews in Soviet Moldova exist. I'm also trying to see how Jewish population made history, not just how history it was made for them, not just like what Soviet leaders did to them. I also want to see how they shaped history. And another project that I'm involved with is a project with my two colleagues, one from United States UNC Chapel Hill, Chad Bryan, and another colleague is from Prague, Katerina Chapkova. And we work on a new book manuscript that is dedicated to Slansky trial. And I guess a lot of historians do know about the infamous Slansky trial, where the top communist elites were put on trial in 1952, and the overwhelming majority of them being Jews, including the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, sentenced to death, with like a few exceptions. And the traditional way of looking at this topic is that everything was done from Moscow, by Moscow, through the Soviet advisors, and we actually were trying to make the story more complete. We're trying also to look at the local elites, at the local type of anti-Semitism, and how this story is much more complex than we previously thought before. So I've been working extensively in Moscow's archives for this particular project.
Right. So you mentioned Jan Gross's work as a major influence. And of course, his research caused major debates in Poland, very, very controversial, sometimes extremely aggressive reactions. I'm wondering what kinds of reactions you got in Moldova while you were doing your research on Jewish-Gentile relations and also after your book came out. How was it perceived locally?
When I started my project, I think I was unprepared to such a hostile relation. Just, I said the word relations because, like, indeed, even my relationship with my colleagues aggravated. I was probably naive in my understanding of the stakes, like political stakes in the issue. And I was totally not aware, I guess, at the time that there is such great reluctance towards this topic. Because initially in 2005, when I made this topic as my official research agenda, I did encounter a lot of questions, even from my good friends, colleagues, wondering, like, why am I doing this? And it's a very complex network of issues here involved. And I don't want to bore you like to death with like all the complexity of the issue, but it's tightly connected to the fight over the identity of Moldovans here. And this fight between West and East, and this fight between being pro-Russian or being pro-Romanian, which is in a nutshell this like East and West. So the logic from my colleagues, historians, which I would honestly say that most of them probably are pro-Western, pro-Romanian. The logic is that why would I want to study a subject that brings benefits to the Russian side, the arguments for the Russian side, and put the Romanian history, Romanian administration in a bad light? Don't I understand that I'm doing a disfavor to this fight over the identity? And I've been trying hard, to explain. It's like, well, history, it's not that we're here to serve like political goals. Of course, like a lot of history is used and abused for political goals, but we cannot do this. We cannot just like hide from topics that are unpleasant because a greater political goal is there. So I could honestly say that it was like very difficult. Probably in the first like 3, 4, 5 years, it was extremely difficult. But I think with time and with a lot of factors kind of coagulating together, I can also say that the situation today is very different from the situation in 2005, for example, when I started. So what changed? First of all, in Romania, a lot of things changed. They had this Elivizel committee. The official position of the state is very clear. They assumed the responsibility for the Holocaust. Then there is a much bigger community of historians and also much more connected to the Western world, including the history writing. So at least the new generation of historians in Romania is ready to tackle the issue. The community in Moldova of historians is much smaller and much more conservative. So unfortunately, still during all this period, we do not have historians that would join me, my agenda, or study the subject. They do understand and they see what's happening in Romania, and they see that there is some kind of legitimacy towards the subject, but there is a reluctancy to accept the subject. The opinion kind of that dominates among my colleagues is that, well, we understand. EU forced Romania's hand, EU, NATO, they had no choice. So this is what they did. But Moldova we still have choice. Nobody is like pressuring us. So we'll remain true to ourselves and to our interests. So it's still a great reluctance inside the community itself of academia. But at the same time, people kind of got used to the topic more. They hear more about. They also, I published a lot. Also, they do understand that there is outside legitimacy to this. In the meantime, also the Moldovan government also accepted Elie Wiesel report. So, and there is an action plan. So they started to do some events connected to the Holocaust commemoration. In school, there is already a set of activities like Holocaust Remembrance Week. So things are happening because of political will, because of connections with the outside world. And at the same time, what I see this weak area is the research area, because it's a very independent sphere in a way. And nobody can really push, it's luckily it's a democratic country, so nobody is pushing you and deciding for you what kind of topic you want to do. So I guess a lot of younger colleagues, they just understand that it's an iffy area. You could get into a lot of troubles as a young scholar, especially when you depend on the senior scholars, that the gatekeepers of your career. So they don't want to get involved.
Right.
It's like,
so from the perspective of an outsider or an outside observer, it appears as if in Moldova there are 2 or 3 main hot topics in memory, and specifically the memory of the 1940s, right? So one is the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
The other is the wave of deportations in the late 1940s. And then there's also the famine, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And it seems as if the people studying these topics as historians, but also those participating in memory debates about them, are almost in different camps. And they're, as you were saying, they're seen as sort of positions in a present-day political debate, rather than topics that all equally concern the history of the country. And I'm wondering whether there's any kind of movement towards integrating all of them into a unified narrative of Moldovan history, or is it too early for that?
Well, I definitely would say that it's too early for that, because in order to integrate this, it should be done by historians, right? Because who else will do this? You need to change your mindset as a historian. You need to basically discard a nationalistic approach to history, and to accept that, there are different ways of looking at history. And relatively recently, a colleague of mine, a much more senior colleague, said that, well, maybe this is the time for this kind of integrative approach in the West, but this is not the time for us. Maybe in 50 years' time the time will be ripe for us, but he honestly and genuinely believed that for benefit of our own country and our community, it's the best is to embrace this nationalist paradigm of history. And if you embrace this nationalist paradigm of history, it just doesn't offer you space for this kind of integrative approach. So you should start with reviewing your old view and how you understand history. Right. Otherwise, no.
Well, you're saying that the initiative has to come from historians, and indeed in many countries that was initially the case. But of course, what one could also imagine a different kind of process where there's a demand that builds up from civil society, from the public, from educators, to have a different narrative of national history that they can use in their own work, and then historians follow suit and start doing the research. But you're saying that that's not happening either.
No, and my own judgment of what's happening and the source of change in society, especially in this kind of matters, it's still the priority of intellectuals, intelligentsia, and it's very divided. And it's basically divided on the language principle. So most of intelligentsia, which is Romanian speaking, is like pro-Romanian and nationalistic in a broader sense. And the Russian speaking intelligentsia is like pro-Russian. So it's a very clear divide in this sense. And the kind of initiatives that you were talking about, they usually come through different channels, like OCE initiatives. Yeah, like they basically are the locomotive that's trying to implement this kind of changes in school, for example. And this functions because they do work with ministry directly, and it's easier. Well, these kind of changes that you were talking about, you need to have a social society that thinks differently. But it's a kind of a vicious circle, because the society is educated also by public intellectuals, and these are people who talk on TV every day. So society ends up thinking what the intelligentsia is thinking, and it's kind of reinforcing each other. Not to be like completely negative, I do see that positive things are happening, and under influence of many like micro changes, the environment is more opening and more tolerant, and there are voices that try to create some kind of a middle ground and to shift the population towards the idea of civic identity, because this is what we need. But it's very difficult, because every time, let's say, elections approach, or every time like politics are at stake, these like fragile attempts of like building a common ground, they dissipate, and like immediately society starts to like move again, like to different camps.
Right. So maybe as a last question following up on this, you mentioned the role of international institutions, and you also said that for some Moldovan intellectuals, the influence of the EU on Romania, pushing it to face the history of the Holocaust, is something that they perceive negatively. What do you think the role of those international institutions could be in the future? And I'm asking this because, I mean, some people tend to have a very optimistic view of internationalization, transnationalization, and the integration of post-socialist countries in the international community. But there's also some research that suggests that it could have the opposite effect. That, for example, countries that join the International Holocaust Research Alliance, they kind of tick off some boxes saying, well, we have spent so many euros on Holocaust education, and then everybody formally is happy, and nationalist politicians in these countries are free to just continue catering to their own nationalist constituencies. So what do you think maybe in the long run the influence of these institutions could be? I don't know, let's imagine Moldova at some point joins the European Union. Do you think that this would be beneficial for memory debates in the country, or could it have the opposite effect?
I am definitely a biased person here. I'll start by like making it very clear, and it's also because like I do believe honestly in a lot of values that do come from EU, and also but at the same time, like I'm trying to be as objective as I can, as a historian, and just like even looking at the experience of Romania gives us some lessons, like to then also material for reflection. And what I can see and conclude based on Romanian case is the situation improved significantly. It's not that the situation is like perfect. It's not that there were not backlashes or something. And actually, what is happening in Romania, in a way, anticipates or coincides with the situation that I described. Because also in Romania, the political factor is very active. Like governments doing what they're supposed to do. Institutions are active. Institutions are created. Even research institution that does research, Elvizel Institute, and books are published. But the sphere lacking behind society. A society is the most reluctant and still unhappy, and like big parts, with some islands of changes. That is the part. So we're talking about some desynchronization between how this memory of the Holocaust is happening inside Romanian society. But despite all these like complex situations, things are improving, because if you look, 20 years ago in Romania, you could like be a Holocaust denier and be proud about it, be published everywhere, and have streets of like criminals of war. This situation is not possible anymore, which is a good fact in itself. So judging based on like Romania's itinerary, I do believe that there are good changes that could also lay ahead in Moldova with the help of international institutions, and they could promote these changes in whatever spheres, it's easier or quicker to do. But of course, like society and changing people's minds, it's not the first in that list. Usually they come with time and with a lot of effort, especially education. Like, you're supposed to have generations of kids that studied about the Holocaust, or whatever other issues that are sensitive and that think differently, that their parents were, you're supposed to have a different environment with new ideas that is different in this sense.
Well, that's a nice, cautiously optimistic note on which to end this interview. Many thanks, Diana, for this conversation, and I'm looking forward to many more discussions about Moldovan memory topics at our conference in September.
Thank you.
Bye.